Oh look, I didn't do my everybody's welcome. So good. So we are. Oh, and hi to Mark. We're just making a move already. Um, so we're doing quite a large number of verses today because there's a connection between two things which I had not really seen before. It's really only in preparing. This is what I was just saying. That you reread things and suddenly you start to see things again in a different light. So I think that we will understand the second incident that seems totally disconnected much better if we kind of unpack it together with the thing that comes first. And the thing that I'm kind of the theme I'm giving across the whole thing is that there's a kind of preparing. Jesus is preparing in this teaching the church for the nations. Now, if you put that into kind of a context, my understanding is of alongside the early church fathers that Matthew's gospel starts to be produced almost straight away. It's the first gospel to be written. So I don't take some of the modern theories, which is more of a compromise with those who don't want to believe anything and those who do, where they kind of see Matthew being written around 70 to 80. I think it's very clear that all of the Gospels are written before the destruction of Jerusalem, because they refer to Jerusalem in the present tense, as if it's not being destroyed. Matthew is the first, and if you do understand that, and you see the sections in which it clearly has been issued in, that the Sermon on the Mount kind of represents a body of teaching around which there's some introduction and some illustrative miracles. Then there's probably a sense in which this could well be, I'm not saying this is, I'm saying this could well be being issued as part of the apostles' teaching. See, they're all together in Jerusalem. They're conferring on how they're going to get taught this growing church. And then Philip has gone out, if you remember, and he goes into Samaria. And suddenly there's Samaritans getting saved. And Peter goes up there and they start to pray for those folks. And then he goes up to Lydia and Joppa. And we start spreading out onto the coast. And so the Jerusalem church, if you think of that series of growth, you can see how Matthew develops. The material around the Sermon on the Mount is very Jewish centric. You need to know an awful lot about the law. It's presented in terms of Jesus being the prophet who comes after Moses. So there's a very kind of sense in which the very strongly religiously Jewish mindset works for that. As we move into the kind of the next sections of teaching, we unpack. Jesus was kind of teaching on the parables. The parables are much more open to people who are less au fait. They're less kind of they're living less within an immediately Jewish culture, but they're perhaps God-fearing. But everyone can relate to the parables in the way where, to really fully understand some of the Sermon on the Mount, we have to remember the Jewish laws that it was based on. And so we've had that kind of period, and now what we actually have is this issue that starts to come down to, if you like, issues of Jewish nationalism. So we're going to kind of start to hit eating and feeding rules, and of course we know that that's become the rules about how we eat together and how we share life together when we come from different cultures and different nations becomes a major theme during the Book of Acts. But actually, as the Book of Acts is recording events, kind of looking back on events and the history of the church as it spread out, Matthew's gospel is kind of emerging while those events are happening. And so I kind of see there being something, if you like, as the apostles there working in Jerusalem, as they put together the apostles' teaching to understand Jesus for those who are becoming Christians. It makes sense that it's not that they've made the events up. They happen within the flow of Jesus' ministry, but they show Jesus moving from he's kind of reached the pinnacle of his popularity in the feeding of the 5,000 in the gospel, and now he's beginning to start to move and have an impact further afield. And we transition there by some questions about, if you like, traditions and customs and culture. And how they've taken the place of the Word of God in certain kind of Jewish manifestations. So that's an awful lot. I'm just saying they're looking at these verses. So let's actually look at them. So remember, we finished last week with the beginning of verse 10. Having summoned the crowd, he said to them, "Hear and understand." So, and I put "to be continued." So if you're remembering, remembering last time, we had all the issues of eating laws, if you remember, and how people are eating and so on. So he summons the crowd, big Jewish crowd, and then he unpacks that a man is not defiled by what enters to the mouth, but by what comes out of it. This defiles the man. So, and then the disciples drew close to him. So, the Greek, you could say they kind of approached him or whatever, but I quite like the kind of sense of them drawing close. You can imagine in the flow of teaching, there are times when they want to kind of clarify, and so just drawing a bit closer, you don't have to shout it too loud, so they can ask their questions a bit more privately. And they say, are you aware that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this? So remember what we had last week, and we were looking at I'm just kind of I've suddenly gone one of those sudden brain blanks where I'm just trying to remind myself exactly the flow of the words that Jesus was saying last week, so I can't remember them right now. They'll suddenly come to me. But Jesus had been addressing them on the issues of let me just quickly remind. Hang on a second. I'm just going to quickly, because I don't want to say something that wasn't true, but I'm pretty sure I knew 15. So it's been the traditions and the commands. That's right. And it wasn't just on the eating. That's right. Jesus has addressed them on the issues of how they've allowed their traditions, the ways that they've interpreted the law in the Old Testament, to supplant actually the very words of those things. And now the issue has come up about eating, and so there are, if you like, almost implied, there are traditions around eating, which have also taken a kind of a place where they almost become the edict of God. So the disciples are saying, look, you're aware how offensive this is when they hear this, and there's probably a degree to which they feel it themselves, because we actually do have an emotional response of disgust with food that is not part of our culture. So I'm quite happy because I grew up in a culture where my parents were kind of travelling a lot, and we used to travel with them as small children. I can eat pretty much anything, but my wife, on the other hand, will have a kind of an absolute visceral reaction to certain things like oysters, and certain food things. Sometimes people who have grown up, for instance, in the Islamic world, still can't eat bacon and pig products because there's a kind of a disgust feeling. It's no longer by religious law, it's just that it feels nauseous to them. So there's probably a degree to which some of that is going on within the thinking of the disciples of Jesus. So as he starts to say it's not what goes in to the mouth that defiles you, it's what comes out. They're raising the question on behalf of the Pharisees, who have been a problem already, but they're probably dealing with their own kind of thoughts, but I don't like the thought of that myself. Replying, he, i.e. Jesus, says, every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be pulled up by its roots. And sometimes I used to read that, and I used to think, oh no, that... Well, I was told, I remember when I was at university, I was told by those who were much more of a fatalistic approach to their theology, that this was an evidence from Jesus that God kind of has selected people from before time, before birth, to those who are going to be his and those who aren't. So it's that kind of a very heavy view of election. But I read it now and I think, I just don't read it that way. Because I think what Jesus is talking about when he talks about a plant is these ideas, these ways of thinking, the traditions and the thoughts, and the way in which we take a complex set of instructions, which the Word of God is, and we try to form it into habits and behaviours that I can live by which if I do those and embed them in who I am, it feels to me I'm living securely in the purposes of God. And so I think those are the ideas. They're the seeds that have been planted, and they've grown something, a way of doing something. And so what Jesus is saying is don't be too worried if it's a bit difficult for you. And that's an important principle. Hearing teaching from Jesus that is slightly offensive to us shouldn't surprise us. If it surprises us, then what we're saying is, I think I'm good enough and smart enough that I understand the world better or as well as Jesus does. That's why everything he says I already agree with. In which case he wouldn't have anything worth saying to us. He wouldn't be the Son of God. If he is the Son of God, if he has something worth saying to us, we shouldn't be surprised if sometimes we find it difficult. And I think that's more the flow of what Jesus is saying here, is it doesn't matter too much if they're offended, because actually sometimes that offence is part of the way God is turning over some of the things that have grown as we've tried to do the right thing, we've tried to walk with him, we've come up with little shorthand ways of understanding what it was he really meant when he said something complicated. And those things over time have become very precious to us, but they need to be rooted out, and the rooting out of that is going to cause offence from time to time. So he says that, and interestingly again, as I say, as a kind of a word of advice, and something I genuinely do, without wanting to tell stories that kind of that seem like they're being rude to people. Hang on, just that there is a place where sometimes for God to be able to root out those ideas, those things that he doesn't want people to have, sometimes you have to leave them in the challenge, but to actually feel the discomfort of them rather than actually make them okay for folks. And so actually part of that discomfort is the blind leading the blind. Let's see how well their approach to being very strict about their traditions is going to kind of take them as the world goes forwards. Now I'm just going to bring up, where are we? Yeah, there we go. So I can see who's here. So hopefully that's making sense. I wanted to be kind of as clear as possible that the idea that there's a kind of a flow within this of there's a challenge to we all have religious traditions, and they've grown up sometimes for good reasons, but sometimes they then get in the way of what the truth is, which actually, as we're going to see, starts to become a preventative barrier for those that the Lord wants to bring into his purposes. And sometimes the challenge of those things is going to be feeling difficult for us. Let's not kid ourselves that it will always be easy when the Lord leads us somewhere new. And we prefer to be secure where we need to be. Now, that's not a recipe for saying everything can be thrown away. It's very different. But it is for saying, okay, and I think this is particularly relevant at the moment because certainly, as Joseph will be aware, as we've had a number of new folks coming in at King's Church from different cultures, and it will be a challenge. We have to think a little bit more, as I said, about actually the fact we have a men's breakfast, and yet we have two people who have only in the last few months made the commitment to follow Jesus from Islamic backgrounds, for whom the eating of bacon may still be difficult, if I can put it that way. So we might have ways where we think, well, that's a wonderful our freedom, but even that can be a shrub that needs sometimes to be disturbed. And so some of what Jesus will teach us won't always be easy. That's really where I'm going. The fact that I approve of it is not necessarily, well, in fact, it's not at all, is not actually an endorsement of its truth or not. It's actually more likely, if it really is truth, that it will challenge me. And there'll be times when I will feel it's a difficult thing to deal with. So Jesus says, leave them. They're blind guides of the blind, and if the blind lead blind, both will fall into a pit. Let's just go over here. So Peter, responding to him, said, explain this parable to us. So he said, look, are you also still without understanding? Don't you see it yet? How everything going into the mouth goes into the stomach and is ejected into the sewer. So the image that Jesus creates is, of course, a total through flow. There's nothing originating in mankind in this process. But there's also something in which it doesn't matter whether the food is clean or dirty. If you eat it, it all ends up pretty dirty as it goes out. So there's a two-way of looking at things. One is it doesn't matter how kosher or how good your eating requirements are, how much you wash your hands. At the end of the day, it all comes out the same way, and that's not the nicest of stuff. But we don't actually think that makes you bad, or you shouldn't think that makes you bad. On the other hand, as Jesus turns it around, it's the things that come out of the mouth that issue actually from the heart. So the thing that goes forth from the mouth issues from the heart. And these are the things that corrupt us or defile us. And so there is again, as we're kind of putting the mix in, the heart is that emotional centre. There are things that Jesus will call us to do that will be challenging to us at an emotional level. And actually, it's that very that part of the reason why that needs to be filtered or turned up, or the earth of our emotional centre needs to be turned over, is because there are all sorts of things in there. It's part of almost the process. Because actually there are opinions that come out from what we say, there are judgments that we make with our mouths that are reflective of a settled kind of emotional state, which often is not what God desires for us. Because out of the heart come forth evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, sexual immorality, thefts, false testimonies, slanders. These are the things defiling the man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile someone. It's kind of, actually, remember how it goes. They weren't very clean when the food goes in. It's not very clean when it comes out, but it all passes through. Whereas what's coming out of the mouth originated in us. It's much more of a sign of what we are. So I've rushed through these first verses because I wanted to put them in kind of juxtaposition with what comes next, because we will often, well, I certainly did, I've often divorced the two. Often the way you read, you kind of stop. Because what comes next is, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. So as we've seen, Jesus has seen the pinnacle of his ministry in Galilee, the huge crowds coming to see him. And they're probably on their way, because the feeding of the 5,000 we saw happening just before Passover. They're all heading down towards Jerusalem for Passover. This is the Passover that Jesus seems to miss. And so probably the leaving of that place and withdrawing to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Reading into that, I suspect that this will be the last Passover before Jesus' final, it's the penultimate Passover. Jesus isn't going to it. Is there something there's something going on inside of Jesus with his own ministry as well, because he's preparing himself for his final year. So he takes some time out and goes up to Tyre and Sidon, which are on the coast, slightly north of Galilee. And so notice, which is the way I'm translating behold, so notice a Canaanite woman from this coast. Sometimes you'll see the phrase is something like the region, because the word is a kind of boundary or marker. So some treat it as coast and some as a region. But Tyre and Sidon are both on the coast. So a Canaanite woman from this coast approached and was crying out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is miserably possessed by a demon." Again, we often put the words severely, but the word can mean miserably. And actually, demonic oppression does make people very miserable. We in kind of cultural terms, and we like to think of those who are demonized as being horribly evil, but actually the majority of folks are just horribly miserable. So I think it was quite nice, the fact that you can translate it with the word, she's miserably possessed by a demon. She's probably, that now it's been kind of commented on before, there are both the in the ancient world, demonic affliction kind of probably covered some of the things we refer to as mental health, as well as the real kind of oppression sides of things as well. But whatever it is, she's very unhappy. The mother is very concerned. And then we get this really interesting passage, because I always found this one of these challenging passages on a personal level, because Jesus seems to behave in ways that I think of as quite rude. Because I'm kind of taught, we want to respond kindly, we want to do nicely. So Jesus has left the huge crowds. He's been speaking about things that are probably challenging, certainly challenging to the Pharisees. If they want to stay there, they have to probably raise questions for the disciples. Jesus does that a few times. In John's Gospel, we have a slightly more explicit, when Jesus talks about eating my flesh, drinking my blood. I haven't actually, should have checked actually whether that looks as though it coincides roughly with this period. It might do, in fact, that Jesus is talking about things that kind of causing an emotional reaction. Because if I've never eaten unpleasant, dirty things, then actually the source of it makes me feel genuinely sick. As with my wife and oysters, for instance, as I said. So here's the situation, and here's a woman with need, and it's a need that is clearly demonic, and Jesus came to destroy the works of the evil one. She's crying out, and he's not answering her. He didn't answer her a word, or actually the strange grammar of the sentence is he's he's kind of it gets across the idea he's answering her by not speaking. He's just kind of, it's almost like he's ignoring her. And as his disciples drew in and advised him, saying, "Send her away, because she's crying out after us." So you can imagine there's a woman who somehow put together and understood who it is. Maybe she's heard them talking. She's heard the stories of the healer from Galilee. Suddenly the healer from Galilee seems to be nearby. She's trying to get in close. There are 12 guys around him, at least 12. There are more probably, in the kind of the retinue. And she's kind of on the edge, wanting to kind of get in. They're probably physically standing in the way. In fact, I think in is it Luke's Gospel, I think it talks about them being in a house at one point. So she's trying to get close but can't. And moreover, answering, he said, so they're saying, so his disciples have now come in close. They say, "Send her away. She's crying out after us." Moreover, he's answering, he said. So this is probably almost more even within, well, sorry, I say this probably. You can't say this definitively, but the English word "said," based on the Greek word for saying, it's not in the continuous sense of he's saying this. So often in answering he will be saying, but in answering he said, which can sort of imply that he's had as they've gone up to the north, there has been a discussion about Jesus' calling, and so this answer may be a part of the framework of as they're going along, rather than a deliberate response. But either way, you hear it. There's something to the disciples where he said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." That's something they understand. They're trying to be protective of Jesus because this is a Gentile woman, Syrophoenician woman, Canaanite woman. In his conversations, they've understood that maybe one day they're going to be sent out. So certainly if you go back to in Matthew's Gospel to Matthew 10, Jesus, when he sent them out, says one day they'll be standing before kings, and it's plural. It's not just a king. There's a kind of there's an expectation of Gentile mission right the way from the beginning of when Jesus starts to talk about those things. But perhaps there's an understanding that actually he himself will fulfill his mission within the nations of Judea and Israel. And now he's stepping outside of those zones. They remember he's only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But she came up and was worshipping him, saying, "Lord, help me." Now there's an interesting thing in the Greek word for worship, which is I should have looked out to remind myself. It's got the word, basically it has the word in it for a dog, which will make sense obviously as we move on. So the Greek word that's used here for worshipping is about kind of groveling and cowing down, and it's actually it's thought to be based on the idea of the way in which a dog kind of grovels and licks your hand. And so that whole, we don't have an exact English word for that style, but it's the kind of "I recognise that you're my master" sort of thing, like a dog does. And so the actual Greek word contains the Greek root of the word for a dog, kuonos, I think it is, which of course suddenly makes more sense in the kind of in the flow of the Greek than it does in English. Because we get this kind of strange statement from Jesus, which I'll come to in a minute. But I want to show you how the discussion and the association of Gentiles with dogs has come about as a sort of a Jewish tradition, which has been the very things that Jesus has been challenging. So here's the tradition. So out of the Talmud. The Talmuds are, although they weren't fully written down until after Jesus, they reflect teaching from the rabbis from before them. So I don't know exactly what the date of this particular phrase would be, but you get ideas like this. If you eat with a Gentile, it's the same as eating with a dog, and there's some very rude things said in the Talmud about Gentiles, but here you see this kind of very strong association. Now, that association is, if you like, is a tradition. It's a human tradition that has been based on genuine biblical texts. Now, what are the biblical texts? So the biblical texts are in Exodus, where it says, "You shall be holy men to me, therefore you shall not eat any meat that is torn by animals in the field. you shall cast it to the dogs. So if you find one of your sheep has been kind of killed by a wolf, or could be by a lion, could be by anything, whatever, you can't eat it, but you can give it to the dogs. Does that make sense? And then in Deuteronomy, it then says, you shan't eat anything that's died of itself, which would include anything you find out in the field. Yeah, but you may give it to the foreigner living among you. So the Jewish rabbis equated the two. If it's kind of like something that's died, you can give it to the dogs, or you could give it to the foreigners that live among you. Does that make sense? And it became part of a whole way of talking about the Gentiles in a very derogatory kind of a way. I won't put some of the other things that they put up there, because some of them are quite vicious. They include kind of the ill treatment that leaves in death and so on. They're very disparaging, some of the rabbis, about the Gentiles. But this was quite mild, but you can see how there's something here biblical, and they've looked at it. They come up with a tradition that equates the two, that therefore Gentiles and dogs are about the same status level, if that makes sense. And so there's something kind of, there's a whole host of little ideas and things going on. There's this woman who worships in a way that's probably quite groveling, like the way a dog shows submission to its master, because it's there in the kind of the text. And for the disciples who are part of the discussion, who recognise, probably because of what Jesus has taught them before, that his ministry is going to be in Jerusalem and Judea, it's not going to go out wider, even if they're going to go out wider. They're asking kind of, they're recognising that he's sent to the lost of the nation of Israel. This woman's from outside of that mix. He makes a statement, and we have to assume, as I put it that way, that Jesus understands something of the wisdom of the woman who's going to respond very well to this. So we go back to the text. So in answering, he said, it's not appropriate to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. So he's kind of he's playing on some of the traditional ideas that are being kind of challenged at this point. And she said, yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. And Jesus answered, and also the word used here for dogs is actually kind of they're household dogs. They're not wild dogs, so they're like pets. So even those kind of dogs, they do at least get treated out of they're within the kind of the wider sense of the household. And Jesus answers, and I don't think his answer, this is personal because it's the way I understand the text, but I don't think his answer is kind of, I'm surprised you've got so much faith. I think he already knew. I think it's almost kind of, there was a sense of Jesus understands, and actually there is a teaching moment going on here for the disciples, which is perhaps why in the issuing of Matthew's Gospel, Matthew is now moving from the time which is all about how how we understand Jesus from a Judaic position now into a much more worldwide type of sense. Matthew's Gospel is taking that journey. So as we move on to the sections that we've been going through, which are beginning to push outside of a purely Jewish understanding of Jesus. And here is some illustrations of some ways in which the traditions that have kind of shaped our culture for the long term have been challenged by Jesus. And actually he kind of raised questions and recognises the needs outside, because actually we're now in that phase. We've just had people going all the way up to the coast, to Lydda and Sharon and those kinds of places. That's what's been going on if we read the book of Acts. And so to me, I think some of the framing, if you like, of this passage in Matthew is the very debates that we read about, of course, things like the Council of Jerusalem, where they kind of try and sort these issues out and so on. And so Jesus is highlighting here as a woman with real faith. He's already understood that. It's not because she gives a clever answer that he thinks it's faith. The very thing that put her there in a worshipful way, recognizing that there's something there that she needed in that kind of humility. The sort of I don't want to use the word groveling humility, because I don't think that's not the right way of seeing it, but that kind of very submissive, knowing that I'm totally dependent on who you are, that kind of humility was an expression of the faith she had. And so he affirms to her, your faith is great, it should be as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that very hour. So I never kind of finish a nice kind of with a with a nice conclusion. Now how do we? But that although I probably haven't done it very well, because as I say, in many ways it was just in rereading for I started to see the pattern. But on a personal level, I was quite encouraged because I thought, oh, do you know, I've never seen that before. The debate that's kind of going on that frames this as the transition happens in Jesus' ministry from now starting to look outside of Judea as we move into Jesus' final year of his life. So we're at the beginning of the final year of his earthly life. That now there's much more of the tension between the Jewish context in which Jesus has formed and come into, and the world he's going to send his disciples out into to challenge. So would anyone like to ask anything or flag anything or even challenge some of those ideas at this stage?
When I did the Kairos course, I don't know if anybody knows that, but they took this passage and actually thought that Jesus was saying this with a twinkle in his eye, and that he was trying to get a response from his disciples,
Yes, so that
as which sort of is not far from what you're saying, I
no,
think.
that's right. I'm saying that in many ways, it's what he's doing is a teaching experience for his disciples.
Yes.
So I think he already knew the woman's faith before she
Mm.
said what she said. But I think the fact that Matthew has put it, because time wise it's probably not quite as quick as it feels like in Matthew, but he has chosen to juxtapose questions about the law, tradition, how we eat, with the kind of then suddenly this story. And then what we're going to see is as Jesus kind of now heads back down towards the south, he's really coming to the fulfillment of his Jewish ministry, which happens in his lifetime. So I think and that's why I'm trying to put all those bits together. I think even the issuing of Matthew's gospel, which was probably done in sections because it's organised in sections, and probably and this is probably happening at the point where, as I say, some of those same areas are being reached with the gospel as the gospel is going out from Judea. And so these are early discussions, and the disciples are almost remembering for themselves. Oh yeah, and Jesus kind of highlighted this with this woman, and so on. So I totally agree, Barbara. I think that's they probably said it nicer and more clearly, but that's what I was trying to get across, is that I think even the Jesus statement of sent to the lost, I think that was not a one-off statement. I think that was an understanding of his ministry that he'd talked about with his disciples before. My ministry is here in Jerusalem. I'm reaching the lost tribes of Israel, the lost children of Israel, not the lost tribes, the lost children of Israel. But you have been commissioned with a ministry that's, as I said, it will stand before kings and before Gentile rulers and so on. He's already anticipating what comes after. And so there's a little nux or little crux of it going on in this discussion.
Mm.
Good. So yeah, good on the Kairos.
Yes, I think they explained the delay as really Jesus giving the disciples opportunity to sort of jump on board
Yeah.
before he comes in.
Yeah.
Hi, Chris.
Hi there, Joseph.
Yeah, you mentioned something about people coming to our church and different culture and things like that. Yeah. How do we discuss the issue of food considered to be unclean? Do we, how do we deal with that?
Yeah. So I'm at the moment. It's just something that I'm conscious of, and I've raised, for instance, with after the last men's breakfast. I've just flagged with the guys who do the cooking for the men's breakfast to say, actually we might want to think about getting some kind of some chicken sausages, for instance. Because I know when Muslims who become Christians who never lose their kind of the disgust feeling of anything to do with pork or pigs, and others who see it as a freedom issue and are happy to have a bacon sandwich. So we don't want to impose their response on them, but we want to give, as Paul says, don't let your freedom become somebody else's problem. we want to create a context where they can feel honoured and comfortable and do things at their own pace. So So it's something that I'm just aware of, and raising with folks as it comes along. That we need to think about those things.
Yes. And the other one, probably just the scriptures we read. I know I came late. I mean, I joined a little later. You might have discussed this earlier about the Gentiles. Jesus there is saying he sent to the lost children of Israel.
Yeah.
And in the early days, the Jews also did not want to reach out to the to the rest of the world. How do we today deal with that?
So I think that's what I'm saying is Jesus's flag, that his ministry happens in an environment of Jewish culture, Israeli culture, because actually it gives us the theological understanding of his saving work. If you took him away and you dropped him into southern England and he dies on the cross and the Romans crucify him, it means nothing. But actually you have all of the prophetic and everything else. So doing what he does in Jerusalem, just outside Jerusalem, probably on the mountain where Abraham looks up and sees in the distance and says God will provide a sacrifice, all of that history kind of wraps and gives meaning, narrative meaning, that we have an authenticated record of through scripture to what he does. And his initial disciples, who are all Jewish as well, understand that strongly, but he's then equipped them to be able to take that further afield. So I think, as I say, this is the last year of Jesus' life. He knows he's going to die in Jerusalem. He makes that statement about a prophet dying outside of Jerusalem. That's not something to happen. It needs to happen there. But that doesn't mean to say that, because he's right from the very beginning, as we've touched on this before, he's regularly raising issues that set the wider context, the global context of the nations. Right the way back from his baptisms, where Psalm 2 is quoted, and Psalm 2 has "Ask of me and I'll give you the nations," and then Jesus is tempted to try and get them via other means, but actually it has to be the slow process. Which involves his crucifixion and so on. So I think that, but this, it's both the need for it to happen within that cultural context is about God's communication to us. There is something obviously about the nature of the cross eternally that, in one sense, you could say could happen anywhere, except that if it happened anywhere, we wouldn't understand it. So if you like, the reasons why it has to be in Israel is secondary to the mission of the whole world, which is the whole world eventually can have it explained to them. This is the prophetic tradition. This is what God has done. This is how he has stood with these people. This nation has become a testimony to the power and the grace of God, even in its continued existence. I still like the fact that I think it was, although sometimes these things get misappropriated, but I think when it's said that it was Einstein who responded to proof for God's existence was the nation of Israel. The fact that you have a continuous people that can trace their origins right back to the invisible depths of time, right the way through to the present, and are still there as a distinct community who still have distinct blessings that nobody else has. As I touched on before, that something like 20% of all Nobel Prize winners are Ashkenazi Jews, and yet they represent less than 0.02, I think it is, percentage of the world's population. So you can see the kind of that there's this testimony, and Jesus needs to happen within that testimony. His act needs to happen within that, but its impact is for the whole world. So sorry, that's a long answer, Joseph.
It's a good answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Any other thoughts or questions? Or hang on, I just thought, I can do my thanks for watching.
No, that was good. You always look at that passage and think that Jesus seemed to be very rude, but so it's useful to to see the context of the dogs and the Gentiles and where that came from.
And even I think, I don't, because you came in a couple of minutes late, I was saying right at the beginning, the fact that the issue of causing offence for the sake of what Jesus is doing was right there with the previous verses, and he's saying, don't you realise that they're offended? But probably actually they're struggling with some of the eating things that Jesus is saying as well. I've now made a mental note that I have to go back and just work out in my timeline how that this incident correlates with the passage in John's Gospel, because it must be at about the same point.
Yes, because it's after the feeding of the 5,000.
After the feeding of the 5,000, where he talks about eating my flesh,
eating his flesh and blood. Yeah.
Because you often get that in the when you compare the Gospels. So only John's Gospel tells us about Jesus washing feet, but Luke's Gospel does talk about the debate about who's the greatest among them, and actually that's the teaching that Jesus addresses when he washes feet. So if you only had Luke's Gospel, you wouldn't get that how he taught to them about who's most important. It was by getting down and washing their feet. So in a similar way, you could perhaps put the two together just after feeding of the 5,000 in John's Gospel. Thank you, Barbara, for looking that one up. Is when Jesus.
Oh, I just remembered that because I studied that passage.
That's right. Is when Jesus makes some statements about eating his blood and eating his flesh and drinking his blood that offends lots of people, and so that might be part of what they're finding difficult right now. And even as we saw, the disciples found it difficult. So which is what I inferred from Matthew, but actually, which I think is a fair inference, that actually it's not just the disciples. They're blaming the Pharisees, but they're probably finding it hard too. And of course, it's exactly the issue that they're going to find most difficult, because a large chunk of the Book of Acts is dealing with it in different contexts. It keeps on cycling around. They think they've resolved it, but because how do you bring two cultures that have different values and norms, and which ones are really God defined and which ones are just kind of culturally have grown as shrubs that God didn't plant? So if you remember to go back to that verse that we're looking at, that actually all those things have got to be rooted out. So we're going to be offended at some point, because that's part of the way, that's what it feels like when they're being pulled up, things that we think are important that aren't so important.
Kristen, there was a question I wanted to ask. It's something I've been thinking about for a while. It relates to something you'd said some time back about when you were talking about shaking the dust off the shoes and moving on to the next place, and also thinking about John the Baptist and how people were flocking to go and see him, and how he left people feeling better about themselves. And there was obviously quite an appetite in Israel for something spiritual at the time. Like you saying with the shaking off the dust thing, go to a household where people are actually prepared and ready to receive. How much of a part that played, not just because Israel were the favored people, but because practically there was just such an appetite for something spiritual, and there was an appetite for God, that's why that was a priority as well.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important thing, because the more you see the history around the dates of the crucifixion, you see the truth of when Paul says in Galatians about born at the right time. that there is a moment, and actually the last book in just saying, because I just a couple of days ago I got back the publisher's layout for the next Jesus Centered book. I was just thinking through the last book in that series is going to cover much more the end of the Old Testament and the intertestamental period, and the history of the intertestamental period is really interesting, because it produces some of the context which is so becomes such an explosive tinderbox when the gospel starts to spread. So in the intertestamental period produces the synagogue, which becomes the foundation for the understanding of church, and actually becomes the initial place of planting when Paul goes to the Jew first and then also to the Greek. It's because he already has a community that if they capture what the gospel is about, they can build from. And that whole system being spread out all the way through the ancient world is is part of what happened. So it's not recorded in the Bible, but when you actually look at what the impact it has on missions following it, it's absolutely enormous, you see. So you think that's what Paul meant when, although he wouldn't have seen the consequences when he wrote that, he was just feeling it by the Spirit. But we can look back with the benefits of hindsight and say the things that there was something about the context that God had really provided that made it. Let's say it made, if it doesn't sound a rude thing to say, it made Jesus' job easier. You know, at one level it made it tougher because there were people who had very strong opinions and the other way round. But actually it provided something of a framework that you know, again, that's a little bit like answering Joseph's question. That's partly why it is that he knows he has to do what he does in Jerusalem at Passover.
The other thing which thinking about is just the whole sort of human pace, the pedestrian pace at which things happen.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus could have come and set up a healing tent, or you know, he could have supernaturally moved around the country to different places.
Yeah.
And yet he walked and got around slowly. And the destruction of the temple was a whole generation after he was gone. There's just this time. And even the fact that it took thousands of years for Jesus to come in the first place, surely to accommodate normal, natural human social evolution in being prepared for that to happen.
Yeah,
I find it very encouraging.
Yeah. Well, I tend to think as well that whenever I plan something, I never give myself enough time, because in my mind I know we've got to have A happen, B happen, C happen, D happen. That'll be quick. and actually human life isn't like that at all. But it's really interesting when you read a really good historian looking at an event that maybe takes place over several hundred years and over 3 generations, say, you know, and yet they can present it where you can see it totally inevitable. It's going to happen because there is a kind of almost an inevitability. It's like we talk about the Reformation and we think about the events like, banging the treaties onto the door, the Wittenberg door and whatever. But actually, the Reformation period is several hundred years. Starts way before Luther. It goes on way after him. But we want to kind of think of it in terms of, well, it just needed that, and then somehow everything magically was spread all over the world. So I actually think there is something kind of almost more. It's more in that slow but inevitable pace that you see the wisdom of God. Sometimes it's kind of It's the wisdom of a chess player who knows how to set things up over time. So when finally they happen, they can happen quite quickly. But actually, it's a long time of getting the bits in place. So good. So we've probably come to the end now. So I'll stop the recording. Yeah, and I will say a goodbye.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Okay.